Chapter 1: Personal Financial Planning. There are a number of individual factors that strongly influence financial thinking, also known as microfactors. The first is family structure. This has to do with your marital status and dependents. So are you married? Do you have children? Meaning that when you're doing your planning, is it only for yourself or is it for others as well? When others are involved, you have a financial responsibility to them, which will impact your financial thinking. Health is another microfactor that will affect your expected income needs and risk tolerance, and in turn, your personal financial planning. When thinking about your health, you want to look at both the short and long term. Short-term events could include pregnancy and birth, whereas long-term could be chronic illness, an accident, or long-term disability. Your health can impact your ability to work and earn income, as well as impact your expenses towards health. For family structure and health, we'll learn more in later chapters on how to manage and protect your dependents and yourself. Then there's career choice. That's the educational requirements, the income potential, and characteristics of the occupation or profession that you choose. In the early part of the course, that was why you were invited to do a career assessment so that you can see the potential impacts of career choice on your personal financial planning. With age, your needs, desires, values, and priorities will change over time. What you care about right now will likely be different than what you care about in the future. Using myself as an example, I am single with 3 children. I'm in relatively good health, but I did have some short-term health impacts, having recently had a baby in the last year. My career choice, I've actually had 2 careers. First, I was in corporate doing procurement that had different education and income levels and the type of work that I was doing. And in my second career now, I am a college professor, which entailed additional education requirements. And as I'm nearing 40, I'm considered in middle adulthood, and my needs, desires, values, and priorities are much different than I was, say, when I was in college in my 20s. So let's dive a little bit deeper on the age microfactor. Here in this table, it breaks down what you can expect to see as the focus in different life stages. As I mentioned before, I'm in middle adulthood. So my income currently comes from my wages from my job, as well as investments that I have. In terms of my asset base, I am looking to accumulate. I currently have 2 homes. I would like to have a third or find other opportunities to invest and expand my asset base. My expenses are growing because I do have 3 kids, and so to maintain my lifestyle, I will have to pay attention to the cost of taking care of my kids, putting them in childcare, but eventually also sending them off to college and paying for school. And in terms of my ability to assume risk, that's going to be higher, but the willingness to do so will be lower because I have things to protect, my kids, my assets, which are all dependent on me as a source of income. Whereas 20 years ago, in my young adulthood, my focus was on work, and so my source of income was my wages. I didn't have an asset base. My expenses were relatively low because it was just for myself. And my ability to assume risk was low because I didn't have much to protect. And so my willingness was high. I wanted to grow my investments. And so I actually looked into buying a condo as a real estate investment for myself. Systemic or macro factors also affect financial thinking. Sometimes it's easy to forget about that. The first being the labor market. So this is where labor is traded through hiring or employment. Workers compete for jobs and employers compete for workers. So there's a supply and demand for labor. Then there's the capital market. So when we talk about capital, this can refer to cash or assets, and it's traded, oftentimes in the form of stocks and bonds. Then there's the credit market. This is part of the capital market, and here capital is loaned and borrowed rather than bought and sold. And some examples of things in the credit market would be when a small business takes a loan to grow its business, or when consumers take loans to buy a home or buy a car or make home improvements. Business cycles are the fluctuation that we see in economic activity of a nation. An economy tends to be productive enough to provide for the wants of its members. To measure an economy's output or productivity, we use what's called the gross domestic product, or GDP. That's the value of what gets produced in a time period. When the GDP is increasing, the economy is expanding, and when it's decreasing, the economy is in a contraction. An economy that contracts for half a year is called a recession, and a prolonged recession becomes a depression. So you can see that activity here in the gray. In addition to goods and services, an economy should satisfy its members in terms of jobs, because people generally want to participate in the market economy through trading their labor, and they need the wages from those jobs as their source of income. The unemployment rate measures an economy's shortcomings because it shows the proportion or percentage of people who want to work but can't because the economy doesn't have jobs for them. Whereas the employment rate shows how successful an economy is at creating job opportunities for folks to sell labor and companies to efficiently use its human resources. Here in the table, we can see the different stages of the business cycle, from boom to expansion, recession, and depression. And you can see the dynamics of the GDP as well as the rate of unemployment. So for instance, in a recession, you'll see that the GDP is negative or on the downturn, and the rate of unemployment tends to be higher. Stable currency value is another important indicator of a healthy economy and a critical element in financial planning. The value of a currency is based on its usefulness. So when we talk about usefulness, we think purchasing power. That's the currency's usefulness based on what it can buy. So when prices rise or when things cost more, our purchasing power decreases. In other words, the currency buys less and its value decreases. Inflation occurs when the value of a currency decreases. So looking here at our table, when our purchasing power decreases and our currency value falls, prices are also rising. So it'll take more units of currency to buy the same amount of goods. When the value of a currency increases, an economy has deflation. And so if we look here at the table, our purchasing power increases and our currency value rises while prices will fall. So we've been experiencing inflation in 2022, and the hope or expectation is that in 2023, there will be a deflation. Inflation is commonly measured by the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. It takes a basket of goods and services that are purchased by the average consumer in order to measure what the nationwide prices look like. And in the chart here, you can see the percent change in the CPI as a measure of inflation. Here's a graph from Morningstar on the CPI excess inflation. And this shows the percent contribution that we're seeing between 2020 and 2022 in different areas such as hospitality, food, energy, shelter, other core goods, and vehicles. So you can see how these different categories have contributed to inflation. Now that you've been introduced to the micro and macro factors that can impact financial planning, let's talk about the planning process. The planning process starts with defining goals, and this would be a combination of both short-term, intermediate, and longer-term goals. Make sure to watch the SMART Goals video that's posted in Canvas. SMART goals are specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. Once you've defined some goals, the next step is to assess your current situation, because you want to understand what's going to be useful in reaching your goals. The example provided in the chapter when assessing the financial situation for Alice was to take a look at her assets. In this case, she has a car and some savings, as well as her debts. She has a car loan and a student loan. It's also important to understand one's income and expenses. So the income is the money that she's bringing in, and expenses include things like rent, living expenses, and her payments towards her loans, as well as what she's setting aside for savings. Once we've assessed the current situation, it's time to identify choices and evaluate them. Using the example in the textbook, she has some choices. She can work a second job or go to Las Vegas to play poker in order to achieve her goals. With every choice, whether it's to continue doing what she's doing, taking on a second job, or going to Vegas, there are clear benefits as well as explicit costs and implicit costs. It's important to critically think about these costs when trying to decide which choice to make. When thinking about these choices, it's important to consider the risks behind them. And there is some risk behind the Vegas option because it doesn't mean a guaranteed win. She could lose, and if she loses, that will increase her debt and her deficit, which will likely lead to her needing to take on a second job to reduce those expenses. So when we include risk in our decision making, we're thinking strategically not just about the immediate consequences, but also the choices it will preserve or eliminate. So continue doing her main first job and or adding on a second job, her alternatives are maintained, they're preserved. Whereas if you go to Vegas, you could actually lose some of your alternatives. The next step is then to choose a path forward. So hopefully Alice will choose to take on that second job, which will lead her to her financial goals sooner, and then she can assess the resulting situation. Because after you've assessed how things have turned out based on the path that you chose to move forward with, then you'll actually repeat this process where you'll now redefine your goals, identify new choices, evaluate them, and then establish and choose a path forward, and then continue to assess on a regular basis. Thus, the financial planning process is iterative. It is an ongoing, continuous process because things will change in your life. Your goals will change, your needs will change, and new opportunities may arise that will have you evaluating what to do. So as you're going through this week's material, I want you to think about defining some goals for you and using the SMART goals format. And then when you begin to assess the current situation, here are some questions to consider. What are your assets that you own? What are your liabilities, or what do you owe to others? And what's the difference between these two, assets and liabilities? Because that results in your equity. And we'll talk more about these three concepts in later chapters. How can you generate income? What are the revenue streams that you're going to be bringing in? And how much are you paying to live, or your expenses, where your money is going out towards? For now, just keep these in mind. There will be assignments and activities that will let you put some of this information down on paper for yourself. If you have any questions, just let me know.